I want to talk to you about the apostles' teaching. I'm going to read to you from Acts 2:42. The setting is, this is the day of Pentecost, when 50 days after Jesus had ascended into heaven to sit down at the right hand of God the Father. Peter and the other apostles are in Jerusalem. There's the feast of Pentecost going on, which means Jews are coming from everywhere, all around Israel, but also from around the world, because the law of Moses required that Jewish males come to Jerusalem 3 times a year. This was one of them, to celebrate these feasts that God had instituted through Moses. And at this particular Pentecost, for the first time, Peter preaches, for the first time any apostle preaches, that Jesus Christ has been raised from the dead and he's ascended into heaven, and that he is the Messiah long promised by God. And when he finished his message that day, about 3,000 people had embraced it and began gathering to hear more from the apostles. And it says in Acts chapter 2, verse 42, they were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching. They were continually devoting themselves to the apostles' teaching. Now, they were devoting themselves to some other activities as well. It says, into fellowship, to the breaking of bread, and to prayer. But first among those was the apostles' teaching, because this was teaching that no one had ever heard before. Now, people in Israel had heard it from Jesus, but Jesus hadn't proclaimed his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his ascension into heaven, and then his return before that generation passed away. He hadn't proclaimed all those things at that time. So they really were hearing something new from the apostles. And the great wonder and great benefit is that we get to do the same thing. We get to pay attention to those apostles. What they taught, their teaching, was life-changing and unprecedented. And even today, 2,000 years later, we still need to be going back to that. It's just such a shame that the world is not more devoted to the apostles' teaching. These men were the closest to Jesus of Nazareth. They had lived with him for several years, and they heard his teaching over and over, and from one town to another. They traveled with him, and they were sent out by him while he was still living on earth to preach the message themselves, and they would come back and they would report what had happened through their teaching and preaching and the miracles that they'd done in his name. And he'd give them further guidance and instruction. So here at this point, Jesus is in heaven, so he's not present to speak for himself. He's speaking through these men, these apostles. And they alone know what he's teaching. And now they begin passing it on to others, and it begins to spread to more and more people. But in the beginning, it was just the apostles. They were the ones that Jesus had spent time with and had taught and had coached. And they knew what he taught. And he understood the Old Testament, the larger part of the Bible. He understood it in a way that no one else had ever understood it before. Sure, he saw a lot of things the same way the Pharisees and Sadducees did, but he saw some things in dramatically different and unforeseen ways that others had not seen, because, of course, his insights came from God. And those people were devoted to his teaching, but people are not devoted to the apostles' teaching these days. I went to seminary. I was in seminary for, depending on how you count the time, it took roughly 3 years of full-time work to get my Master of Divinity, and then my Doctor of Ministry. That took it took between 1 and 2 years, but you weren't on campus that whole time by any means, because that was a degree that was fashioned for working ministers. But at any rate, I spent a lot of time in seminary, and you'd be shocked at how little of that time is actually spent reading the Bible. And I went to two very fine Bible seminaries, highly respected in evangelical circles, for their devotion to Jesus and the Bible. So they were like the best of the best. But even they, you go to the campus bookstore and you buy all these books, big books, and you got to buy a whole batch of them every semester, and you got to read these books. You got the reading assignments that you're trying to fill out. And yes, if you can squeeze in time for your own devotional Bible reading, that's great. And some of us did, but you're just overwhelmed with information they're trying to put into you, which basically crowd out a whole lot of devotion to the apostles' teaching. And by the way, at these seminaries, even as I say, the best of them, they would say, don't try to understand the Bible the way the apostles did. They were unique. Don't try to understand it like they did. I didn't want to argue because I was a student, and I was there to learn, not to try to educate the professors. But at the time, and then it grew after I graduated, I would think about it, and I just more and more came to realize that's just such a backwards attitude. How in the world can we say we've got a better way to read the Bible than the apostles did? And first and foremost, you've got to read the Old Testament through New Testament eyes, which is another way of saying you got to read the Old Testament the way Jesus did. But they don't do that. And ministers today are taught what their church or their denomination wants them to know. So in a way, it's like, why do any of them even read the Bible? Because you're not allowed to come up with any point of view other than the one you're taught by your denomination or your seminary or your church, whatever it is. And so I finally came to realize that the Bible is for everyone. The Bible's not just for Christians, it's for everyone. God came on earth to live as Jesus Christ, to die for the sins of everyone. And therefore his teaching is for us. He came to teach us how to live, to teach us righteousness, what it is to be right with God, which is to be right. There's no being right unless you're right with God, because he's the source of all righteousness. And the Bible teaches us that we were made to trust him first and foremost, and then imitate him. Now, I want to read you another verse from a couple of chapters later in the book of Acts. This is Acts chapter 4, verse 13. And he was talking about how the Pharisees and Sadducees would observe the apostles. It says, now as they observed the confidence of Peter and John and understood that they were uneducated and untrained men, they were amazed and began to recognize them as having been with Jesus. They were uneducated, untrained men. Well, what the Pharisees and Sadducees meant was they didn't go to our schools. They didn't mean they were stupid, or they hadn't been trained at all. Probably Peter and John, just like Jesus, went to synagogue when they grew up, and they heard the scriptures being read. Of course, all they had at the time was the Old Testament. There was a lot of illiteracy back then, but it didn't really inhibit understanding the Bible, because people could go to synagogue and hear other people read it. Just like, I don't know what the president of France said today, but if he said something important, I'll know what it is because somebody will translate it for me. I don't have to know French. I don't have to know how he said it in French to know what he said. So it says they began to recognize them as having been with Jesus, and that was the key. If they were with Jesus, then they were going to understand things that couldn't be understood any other way. It's not a matter of smarts. It's a matter of who your teacher is. That's what determines the quality of your education. And certainly the quality of your spiritual education is a function of who your teacher is. You're either going to trust other people to teach you, or you're going to trust Jesus. Now, some of you watching this might say, well, Mike, why, you want us to trust you? No, actually, I don't. my job is to help you learn how to read the Bible. I'm going to show you how to read it. And I showed you how I learned how to read it. So that you don't have to go to seminary like I did. Because in retrospect, as I look back, I had to unlearn things that I learned in seminary. We all need a certain amount of help. This is an ancient set of texts, and they weren't written in English, and they weren't written in the way we speak today. So, yeah, we do need some kind of help. But I can give you that help, and you can read it for yourself. And my mission from Jesus is to teach men how to read the Bible for themselves and teach it to their families. And you can do it. And I know you can do it because I did it. And I didn't do a good job of it. I wasn't as faithful as I could have been. I try to make up for it as a grandfather. But we don't need to delve into all my circumstances. But my point is that I know enough to show you how to read the Bible for yourself. And somebody else already taught you how to read. And somebody else already taught you how to think logically, assuming you know how to think logically. And you wouldn't even be watching this if you didn't think logically. There are a lot of people today who don't think logically, but they don't make it very far on videos like this. So you are able to read the Bible, and you're able to teach it to your family. I say read the Bible, I mean reread the Bible, because the Bible is meant to be reread more than it's meant to be read, because if all it was meant to be read is just we'd all read it one time and then go on and do other things, the Bible's not that kind of book. There's just a lot to get, and the only way you can get it all from the Bible is to reread it. And I've been rereading it a long time, but I haven't figured out how to get everything out of it. I'm still getting new things out of it all the time. Good thing is it keeps reinforcing the old things at the same time that it's adding new things. So it's very strengthening if you're the kind of person who wants to live a righteous life. If you're the kind of person that when you die and you meet your Maker at the end of your life and you want to be able to hold your head up, or at least not hang it in complete shame, then you want to learn how to read the Bible and how to prepare yourself, how to live a life that will prepare you for meeting your Creator at the end of this life. So the apostles' teaching is that's the best we can get. That's the closest we can get to Jesus, and Jesus is the closest we can get to God. So that's why their teaching is so critical. And, these are the primary historical sources on the life of Jesus. We don't have to look any farther. And they're available everywhere. You can go to any bookstore, online or brick and mortar. Go to a bookstore and have a Bible and read it and learn what the apostles taught about Jesus and begin to apply that to your own life. And begin to know your Creator, who loved you not only enough to create you, but to give up his life in crucifixion for your shortcomings, for your sins. The apostles' teaching is precious. People are paying attention to all sorts of traditions of men, things that they learned by rote, but that they don't really understand. Go back to the apostles' teaching. Start with the New Testament. Don't try to understand the Old Testament without letting the New Testament teach you about it, because Jesus read the Old Testament in a way, let's put it this way, he understood it. And so he's the best one at explaining it. And the closer you get to the apostles' teaching, the closer you'll get to Jesus.